It's like a dream come true, because we always wanted to have a comic session, in this amazing building. And we have no other than, thank you Malavika for making this possible, and we have no other than the great Paul Gravett, an amazing Dan Raeburn with us. Before I begin, of course, let me talk to you about a bit about them. Of course, if you imagine comics to be the network of, millions of networks, the whole world comics, then you have to pass to one station, and that station is Paul Gravett. Eddie Campbell, one of the best comic artists, actually calls him the man at the crossroads, right? In his comic book. So he's immortalized in the comic book. So he's also somebody who has written amazing books, comics art. He has also written on manga, of course, and he has also curated an exhibition of Barbican, which is called Mangasia. And we'll pass on both the books so that you can all have a look at the book yourselves. So pass it on as we continue our discussion.
But don't keep it.
Okay. And of course, we can go about Paul. Let's talk about Dan as well. Dan is, of course, from the University of Chicago. He's an academic. But remember, he began with being a comics fan, and he edited an amazing zine, The Imp. Okay? And I came to know about Dan through, basically, The Imp. He has written an amazing monograph on one of the greatest comic artists working today, Chris Ware. And so all of these will come up in the discussion. But before that also, let me introduce you a bit to the topic itself. It's called Future and the Comics, right? So it's not about science fiction and all that. It's basically a very umbrella-like term to discuss about the state of comics. What is really happening in comics all around the world? What are the unique things, that's really happening? And there is no other person, to talk about that, to jog us through that better than both Dan and Paul here. So Paul, let's start a bit with you. Since you are the man at the crossroads, you can direct us to directions.
Yeah, do we just do a next and I'll change the slide?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what we'll do is, since it's a very visual kind of a session, we'll not just talk.
Yes.
We'll also
because
show
comics have pictures in them. We must have
Yeah,
pictures.
so if you have pictures, it's always interesting.
There are
And
words
you don't fall
There are words
asleep,
too.
right? So basically,
Next.
this is, of course, when we talk about
How do we change the slide?
yeah, so next, can we change it? Can it be changed?
It should just be the next image.
If there is okay. So when we talk about the future, Paul, you also talk about the past, right?
Yeah.
And
just very briefly, this image here is a cartoon from more than a century ago. I'm sorry it's a bit small on the screen, but the image is very striking, I think. It's an editorial cartoon showing people walking down the middle way, the path of tradition, and all around them, on the cliffs, in the sea, on the rocks, all the landscape is saying, think, think, think.
Think comics.
All their heads are down and walking only along the path of tradition. So this image, I think, sums up where comics are, that they are breaking tradition because they are now thinking. This is a thinking art form, a thinking medium. The creators and the readers are using words and pictures together in ways we never imagined they could before.
Yeah, so basically...
So that's a brick, that's our first image.
Yeah, so Paul... Next, yeah. Next. So Paul, very, very interesting is that when you talk about your love for comics...
Oh, we have the control.
You have a control?
Amazing.
Amazing. I mean, how do you do that? Simple? Does it work?
Maybe at the aim
Oh, yeah. So let me do that. I'm more comfortable
at
with.
the podium. There we go. Maybe back there.
Yeah. So I'm sorry for the technical.
Okay.
Oh, it happened. Yeah. So Paul, when we talk about your love for comics, right?
Yes.
One person crops up I don't know, it's almost anachronistically is Jack Kirby. And you were in love with this person. So can you explain it a bit?
Should we stand up? You should stand up.
Yeah, so it's a comic session, it's all very, very different.
Okay.
They're all standing up, not like the usual session, right?
So you probably all know Jack Kirby because of the Marvel movies, whether it's Black Panther or the X-Men or Thor, or they were all co-created by this one man, Jack Kirby. But Jack Kirby's name is not very famous, not as famous as Marvel, the company, or Stan Lee, the co-creator. And in this comic, you can see it's 2001. He's taken Stanley Kubrick's movie, and having adapted it, he then made an incredible spin-off comic book based on the concepts in Kubrick's film. And this particular story, if we can get to the opening of it, imagines the future of comics. This is drawn in around 1975, something like that. He was imagining the future of comics in 2040, so in 20 years' time. If we go to the next image.
So can we have a next image? Yeah.
There we go. And this is imagining the future of comics, where comics have become completely immersive virtual reality, where you are stepping inside the world of a superhero comic and you become the superhero. If we go to the next image, please. Hopefully, I can't read this out. Next. The word next means next. No, that's the previous one. I know you're not used to
This is funny, but comic sessions are meant to be very, very unconventional, so pardon us.
Well, I think so.
Yeah, is it working? Is it working? I mean, yeah, it is.
Okay,
yes,
right,
it is.
Right. No, we're going backwards. Now you're going to go forwards. Well, this is, that's fine. Here we go. So in the year 2040 AD, comics have reached their ultimate stage. They have offered and become a lifestyle for the descendants of early readers. What began with magazines, fanzines, and nationwide conventions, think of Delhi Comic Con, for example, has culminated in a fantastic involvement with the personal life of the average man, and hopefully also the average woman. I hope, as well. So Kirby, a man in his 60s, working in the 1970s, imagines our future now in the 21st century of comics as some kind of huge digital world that we can enter. Next. There we go. Next. This is a storyline where his character is surrounded by artificial digital stimuli, food, the environment, everything is digitized and virtual. And he is realizing how shallow and empty that is. The phrase he says here, it's not real. I'm a captive in a man-made cage of illusions, a worldwide comicsville, a comic city that's taken over his imagination, which has less substance than my dreams. So this is a warning from Kirby, from Jack Kirby, a visionary artist who was well beyond the conventions of just the superhero, the good guys and the bad guys. And Kirby imagined that the future, we need to question what technology is doing to us and how comics perhaps can be a trap as well as a window and a flowering of imagination.
Paul, one thing I just want to ask, Kirby was also a bit of a loner in the industry, right?
So he was a maverick, definitely, and a visionary.
But a bit of a loner. He was a bit of a different guy in the industry, and the industry exploited him, right? Really.
He was treated very poorly by Stan Lee and the management.
Well, as most creators were in those days, they worked for hire, they got paid a page rate, but they didn't own the copyright, they didn't own the characters. And Kirby, sadly, he didn't get to see the extraordinary flowering of the graphic novel, which he imagined, the underground adult content, which was coming around in the 70s from the underground comics. He was ahead of his time, and unfortunately out of sync, sadly. But his work still speaks very powerfully. Okay, next, I think.
Yeah.
No, that's the wrong one. That's backwards. We need to go forwards. There we go. And I don't want to hold the conversation.
No. We will
But,
have a conversation. Don't worry.
there is a website you should check out called Futures in the plural of comics.org,
Yes.
which is just started and wants to bring together ideas and debate around the world about where we take comics next and what issues they will address, whether it's climate change, sustainability, artists' rights, freedom, digital delivery. It is a next, please. There are
Yeah.
all kinds of events and talks being held in different venues. It began last year in Fumetto in Switzerland, a very good festival, and there are projects developing over the coming years, and you could be part of that. So please come and find futuresofcomics.org. Next,
Yeah.
and next.
And now,
Right,
of
now we
course,
get to
over to Dan, because, he's feeling a bit left out, of course. So Dan, I must tell you, you're actually narrating to us the very, amazing story about the imp, right?
sure.
So can you just walk us through this amazing zine? For the uninitiated, the imp only lasted for 4 issues. And they are amazing issues. They are like monographs, right? On
Yes.
one particular creator. So you have Dan Clowes, Chris Ware, and of course, there is a huge kind of monograph on the Mexican comics. And the very interesting thing is that Dan did everything of it together. It's like a fanboy taking out a fanzine. So Dan, you tell me about that?
Sure. So I started the Imp in 1997. American cartoonists were sort of feeling at an all-time low. There was a real sense of despair among the American cartoonists I knew in Chicago. Chris Ware, Dan Clowes, Ivan Brunetti, Linda Berry, and others. The general feeling was that comics were dying and there was nothing we could do to stop it. I was very inspired by a psychologist, Frederick Wortham, who had been an anti-comics crusader, actually, ironically enough. But he was an advocate of fanzines, and he really admired fanzines. So I decided to start a fanzine that was sort of perversely inspired by the comic books, one of the comic book industry's greatest enemies. Because I thought of myself that way too. I wanted more attention to be paid toward comics that had the same goals as fiction and poetry and memoir, as opposed to just superheroes. So I started this out of my apartment in Chicago in 1997, and I did it for 4 years. I had envisioned it originally as a forum, sort of like long form, but just for writing about comics, and I imagined people would send in 40,000 word essays and I would just edit them and publish them. But nobody submitted anything, so I actually wound up doing...
And the reason they didn't submit anything is because, as you told us over lunch, you put the call for submissions in tiny, tiny print in the indicia, hidden, and nobody knew you wanted anything to be sent anything.
I thought everybody would read the fine print the way they do in...
Exactly, but they didn't find...
didn't.
We didn't know. We thought, this is your magazine.
They just looked at the pictures. So...
Comics people,
Yeah.
yes.
So anyway, I kind of alternated between high subjects and low subjects. So that's my first issue about Dan Clowes.
Yeah.
Second issue, I covered popular comic books. This Christian cartoonist, Jack Chick. He's a fire and brimstone evangelist, and I think he might be the most widely read cartoonist on earth, other than perhaps Charles Schulz, or maybe the guy who did Tintin, obviously.
Yeah. What I like about the Jack Chick tracks is how you find them. Because people, as you know, are wanting to save your soul.
Right.
And whenever I find them, I make a little note on the back where I found them. Because I think they're fascinating that they are circulating like this.
And the whole time I did this, I was aware that I was not unlike Jack Chick, the evangelist, because I was evangelizing for the form of comics. And I was envisioning a moment like this one right here. If you had told me that we would be talking about graphic novels, in Calcutta in the year 2020, I probably
in this incredible setting,
I would have laughed.
Yes.
We never dreamed that was going to happen.
No.
So it was basically an evangelical fanzine publication, but I tried to apply the same editorial standards that I imagined the best editors at the New Yorker, Robert Gottlieb and Wallace Shawn and others would have applied.
Yeah, I mean, as a reader of the Imp, I was really impressed with your writing. I mean, it really inspired me, and I think you were succinct and perceptive in a way that we really needed that kind of criticism.
You
and
really
to
got
have,
under the skin of the, of the comic
exactly.
artist.
And you had
Right.
the length, you had enough space to really go into depth. It also, of course, helped that in the case of Klaus and Ware, you knew these artists personally and were able to get closer to their inner soul and
There's a story
spirit,
there.
yeah.
So when I went to the Comic Book Expo in Chicago in 1997, right before I started the Imp, I went to the Comic Book Expo and Chris Ware was doing a signing there. And when I walked in, he was walking out with his portfolio, and I said, "Oh, excuse me, you're Chris Ware. Can I talk to you? I'd like to interview you for a magazine I'm starting." And he said, "Yeah, sure. I've been sitting here for 3 hours and nobody has asked me for my autograph or to look at my work." And there were hundreds and hundreds of people there, but they weren't interested in what we now call graphic novels. They were interested in more genre-based stuff.
Right. Which year was this? I mean,
1997.
Okay.
So this was the low point,
Yeah.
you know, and that's when I started it. And that's how I got the interview, because he had nothing else to do. He wasn't famous.
now, of course, it would be very different. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So
And you also-
this is the Mexican, issue, right?
This is your fourth and final issue.
It's my
What-
Waterloo. Yeah.
This is
the one
why
that
was it
killed
your
me.
Waterloo? Why was that?
Well, it was 4-color, and it cost so much to print. And I thought everybody would be interested in these comics. They have everything you want from comics in them. They have sex and drugs, and they're lurid and sleazy. But apparently I was alone in this.
We didn't actually put the cover in because it was, I think...
I didn't put
yeah.
my cover, but that is, this is a typical historieta, which is Mexican Spanish for little history.
Do we have anybody in the audience that has come across, that knows anything about Mexican comics?
I think you should be a good,
No, but I'm
point to
just
stand. And
asking
Dan
anybody in
and-
the audience, put your hand
No,
up if you know.
I don't
Do you
think
know?
so.
Probably
Anybody?
not.
Mexican comics?
It's one of the biggest comic cultures
Yeah.
in the world. It was as big as manga.
Actually,
It
more.
possibly bigger, in fact. Yeah.
Once upon a
At
time.
one stage.
But now it's dying. It's a dying industry also,
yeah.
ironically enough.
Yeah, it's a great shame. It's an
But
amazing culture.
Dan, how did you get all these? Because these are not overground stuff, right?
Oh, they're
they
sold
are.
everywhere in Mexico
Yeah,
City.
but you had a very interesting tale of, the way, these magazines made it, right?
Well, I just started noticing them in Chicago everywhere. And
Yeah.
I just bought them in my old neighborhood of
For the
Andersonville.
Spanish-speaking
Yeah.
Yeah, because Chicago...
Americans, yes.
Chicago has officially 1 million Mexicans in it, which means really probably 2 million. So it's a very significant population. And so these comics were everywhere.
I found them in San Francisco as well. There were shops selling them there.
Yeah. But then I went to Mexico City and met the people who made them, which was a story in itself. That was a lot of detective work, and I had a lot of help. And I interviewed them, and what I found was that they work in what's called maquiladoras, which is, the translation would be basically chain gang labor, almost like assembly lines. They work 20 hours a day, and they're really talented cartoonists.
But their productivity was astounding.
It's
wasn't it? I
astounding.
mean, we're used to manga artists making 20 pages a week, but these guys would do
20 a day.
20 pages a day.
A day.
Admittedly small pages.
And they were really ambitious, talented cartoonists who are sort of forced by the ruling class that owns the publishing industry to churn out this dreck. And they dreamed of doing serious graphic novels, but they were forced to do this dreck. But they were able to slip in their subversive ideas and imagery into the comics. Like in a typical scene, somebody will be getting mugged in an ATM because they're crime comics. But the guy who's getting mugged, you would know, if you knew Mexican culture, you would know the guy who's getting mugged is Carlos Monsiváis, who's one of Mexico's leading intellectuals. Or if there's a painter, it would be Tamayo, and anybody who's Mexican would know, oh, that's the famous painter. So they managed to slip their own intelligence into this otherwise
subverted,
this
yeah.
sort of brain-dead genre.
Paul actually went to Mexico, remember?
I did
some
too.
days
I
ago,
did 2 years ago.
And of
yes.
course,
and sadly, this popular,
Yeah.
admittedly trashy but popular comics have pretty much disappeared.
why
and
do you
couldn't
think so? I
find
mean,
them.
is there a reason you found out, even as an outsider?
They became bored with the public became bored, and also, of course, comics are always competing with other entertainment,
forms of art.
Yeah.
and certainly with the smartphone, digital delivery, and everything else. The comics compete more and more, and essentially any country that has a golden age means they've had a good time in the past, but
Yeah.
it's
Yes.
not so good now.
Yeah.
Only Japan has never really had a golden age of comics because it's continually good.
It's
It's
relentless,
continually
right? They're like
relentlessly good.
relentless, yes. So maybe the next one, we can have a go. And of course, I want to ask Paul specifically here, there's this very idea of comics being low art, right? Now, of course, you have comics in the galleries, right? So the very form of, the very notion of comics having cultural legitimacy. And, Paul always loved to start with this
This is a
amazing
great- this
quote
is a
by
great
Salvador
moment, yeah.
Dali. We would love to do this.
Well, Salvador Dali here is in Paris in 1967, and he's in one of the very first comic book stores selling old French comics, like Journal de Mickey with Mickey Mouse, for example. And he's being surreal. He is Dali. If you've got it, flaunt it, is one of his lines.
Yes.
If you've got it, flaunt it, right. And he is saying here that comics will be the culture of the year 3794. And of course, he was deliberately being witty and surreal, thinking, of course, comics will never become our culture, and if they do, it will be many, many centuries to come. But Salvador Dali was right. He just got the year wrong. He should have said in 2020, because here we are.
Yeah.
At
But we have a
KM,
bit of time
and
to go.
comics are culture.
Yeah.
But he was also being ironic because at the time in 67, at the Palais des Arts Décoratifs, which is part of the Louvre in Paris,
Yeah.
there was the first major European, anyway, exhibition of comics, which of course grew out of the pop art wave. So he was also commenting and perhaps competing with that because he saw comics could threaten his surreal painting and art, perhaps.
So this is also one of the things that I want to talk about, the very fact that it's a low art, but it's also, gaining more and more traction, in a different way. Say in the galleries, for example, who would have imagined comics in the galleries,
Exactly.
Maybe even 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. We don't know. I mean,
Well,
so
Dan, you must have been aware with
this,
of
of
Mouse. The breakthrough of Raw magazine must have been an inspiration to you as
so
well.
Dan, can you just
Yes, it does.
tell a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, in the late 80s, I think Art Spiegelman and Justin Green and some other artists, but Art was the first graphic novelist to make them acceptable, which was wonderful. And when I explained that I was writing about comics, adult comics, people they could finally, I would say, like Mouse. And they'd say, oh, I know what you mean. And that was a big step forward. The problem was booksellers and publishers decided that it was a one-off thing.
Yeah.
And it was kind of, that was the
Even the Pulitzer Prize that it got was a special
Pulitzer
Pulitzer
Prize.
because they weren't quite sure what to do with this
Yeah.
weird comic book thing.
Yeah,
Yes.
and I think it took another decade for other people, especially for publishers, to recognize that it
Yes.
wasn't just a one-off thing. And they sort of, as Art Spiegelman always said, it was a special prize like the Special Olympics.
I think literary prizes still elude comics. Sabrina was nominated, of course. It never won, right? In the Booker.
For the Booker Prize,
For the Booker.
yes.
So,
Next.
so basically, maybe a bit more about this.
But yeah, I mean, one thing, Spiegelman, of course, Mouse became a phenomenon. I imagine many of you in the audience have read it or know
Yes.
about this book.
How many of you have read Moss? I mean, but that's
Many.
quite,
That's
quite a
wonderful.
lot of
Yeah,
fans.
yeah.
Yep.
And for many people, I think it was a wake-up call for people who had not thought that comics could deal with such difficult subject matter, and to make it accessible and emotional, and to use many levels of masking, of using the funny animal motif, which would seem utterly inappropriate to most people.
Right.
He subverted many of the problems we have with comics and made them work. And it's limpid to read. So, I think this is the thing he made for. He strove for, I think, is to make an accessible comic. Nothing that's too complex.
Right,
It reads very, very easily.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think comics are the art of reduction and simplification. And Art can talk about this better than I, but they're essentially a language of stereotypes.
Yes, exactly. And you can play with those stereotypes. Clearly, the cat and mouse
Yeah.
was the greatest stereotype. It's Tom and Jerry.
Right.
It's Crazy Cat and Ignatz. It's the cartoon.
And it was the Nazis and the
Language.
Jews,
Yeah, exactly.
So he used stereotypes to get beyond stereotypes.
And the great power also of Mouse, which is worth remembering, is that the original artwork is the same size as the printed book. Usually, the artwork that's drawn for comics is drawn at least half up or twice up, so everything looks spectacular. We know people like Chris Ware and Klaus, they work on a much larger scale. But the reason for that was also because Spiegelman wanted you to really feel you were looking at something that a hand had drawn, and a hand had written, that's gone off, I think. A hand had drawn, so that you would feel you were almost looking at the original copy, the actual ink-made page, as opposed to a printed book. It can give you that immediacy, I think, on the page. I hope that works now.
Don't worry, it works. Yeah, so of course...
But we've jumped to some other things, because part of legitimacy clearly is also that we have comics not just in the academia and in literary prizes and etc., but we have amazing museums for comics and centers of comics. France has really one of the biggest comic cultures in the world, over 5,000 books being published every year. And they have opened in 2009, so just over 10 years ago, they opened this beautiful museum in Angoulême, which is the biggest comics festival outside of Asia devoted to comics.
The Comic City, yeah?
It is the city of
the
comics.
City.
And I'm there actually next weekend.
You have the festival.
The festival is on.
So Angoulême is next week, I think, yes.
I've been going since 1984, and it's my new year. My new year begins in Angoulême, because it's so inspiring and so international.
Yeah.
And then next image, please. There's also, of course, many museums dedicated to one great comic artist. In
Tintin
Japan,
Museum.
there are many of them. This is the one dedicated to Hergé in Belgium,
Yes.
which is like a cathedral to the clear line. And I recommend you visit it.
Yeah, and then of course, so this is something you need to explain, Paul.
So that's the
This
museum
image.
aspect. There's also the literary recognition beyond maybe just an occasional special award, which can happen. In the UK, we've had the Royal Society of Literature, which has not really usually accommodated people writing with pictures as well as words, has accommodated several graphic novelists, including Percy Simmons, Raymond Briggs, Neil Gaiman, and Brian Talbot. Only in the last 5-10 years or so has this happened, as they've realized these are valid, important writers who happen to use words and pictures. So another remarkable change. And the next one? Just briefly, these are two things that I've done. With the British Library, I co-curated their first ever exhibition about comics. And I can tell you, when it was announced, there was great media attention and some real worries. What is going on here? The British Library showing comics? This is the dumbing down of civilization. We knew we had some people who were upset that comics were even being shown. The British Library, of course, has the biggest collection of British comics in the country.
That's like 2014, right?
2014,
And
exactly.
now, of course, things have changed, remember?
But they have the biggest collection because everything has to be deposited there for copyright. But they had never done anything with their comics collection until me and my colleague John Dunning were able to come in as external curators. And next one. This is the Mangasia exhibition, which I've circulated, so you'll see about. That's an exhibition that includes comics from India, from China, from many other Asian countries, alongside the comics of Japan. And he's touring around the world for 5 years with a book going with it. And the next one. And this happened in the summer of this year.
Yes.
You saw it when you came
I just came and
to
saw
London.
it.
This has been a phenomenal thing to have manga appearing in the British Museum. Again, who would ever
Holy
thought it would
Grail,
happen?
you know? And
The
you
British
have manga.
Museum is actively, and for many years, in fact, since its foundation, has been collecting Japanese popular art, manga, hokusai, hiroshige, right through to today, to Tezuka and current artists. And it was the most popular exhibition, second
It's a
only
huge,
to the
huge
Vikings.
exhibition, right?
180,000 people came, and a very impressively staged exhibition. So extraordinary times. And I'll just wrap up, but these are the exhibitions that have made a big impact. Next. In Japan right now, a huge exhibition for the first time for a living manga artist in the major national art museum in Tokyo. Next. There's some images from that. And next. And in Taiwan, I was there last year. The government is really pushing comics, has opened a special base, a center for comics in Taipei.
Yeah.
Okay, next.
So now, of course, let us go to Dan back, because, we are talking about cultural legitimacy of comics, but let us also look at the diversity, because that will be the final touchstone of what comics will be going to be like in the future. So this is, of course, Joe Sacco,
Yes,
right?
who was supposed to be here.
Who was supposed to be here, but maybe next year.
Next
Next year
year.
we'll have
He'll
him. But what I want to tell you, ask you, because you work in non-fiction now, you know,
Right,
you
I do.
supposedly have retired from comics. You haven't. You don't retire from
I'm out of
comics.
retirement.
No, you don't retire from comics ever.
We've dragged you out of
Yeah,
retirement, I think.
correct. So you know, this reportage thing, you know,
Yeah.
the kind of journalism thing, and you know, today in this world where
Non-fiction
everything,
comic, yes.
non-fiction comics, and today
Yeah.
where everything is, you know, kind of simulation, where the truth and untruth thing is, you know, such a blurry kind of thing.
It is.
So how do you sort of explain this explosion of journalism in comics?
Well, I think
Journalism comics.
I think it's really down to Joe Sacco. I think he pretty much single-handedly not just popularized, but arguably invented the form with Palestine, his book of reportage about life in the occupied West Bank, where he embedded himself with Palestinian families for years at a stretch and wrote the sort of deeply reported and researched nonfiction that would normally be published in literary magazines or by major publishing houses. And what he does, what he calls subjective journalism. In the United States, there's this myth that journalism should be objective, and he doesn't buy that. And what he does is subjective journalism. And I think what's so compelling about it is that he does not pretend to not take a side in the wars that he covers. He's generally on the side of the Palestinians. And in India, as you can see here, he's generally on the side of villagers who are resisting multinational corporations and
Yeah,
others.
so this is Kushinagara from, you know, the short comic, you know, from journalism, his
Yeah.
book, Journalism.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about what makes it superior to photography or straight writing is that it's as I said earlier, comics is the art of reduction. If you took a photograph of this van driving along in this field, it wouldn't have the same impact that the drawing does because there's too much information in it. When you look out at Calcutta today, you look onto any street, there's a million different things in your field of vision. But if you subtract them and select and choose what to accentuate, I think you actually get a better picture of what it feels like to look at this than you do through a photograph. That gets complicated, and we'll get to photographs later. But I think it's the art of reduction, and he's able to draw essential but respectful caricatures of people. Usually caricature implies something negative, but I think he's turned it into a positive, and he's really able to capture the essence of people and their personality in a very respectful and empathetic way. And that's very difficult to do in prose.
And he uses text very interesting, doesn't he? Because his captions are kind of almost like bits of paper
Yes,
or notes that
yes,
have been
yes.
sprinkled
Yeah,
and dropped across the page, and they're often broken up. The narrative is not in one
right.
big chunk.
That's right.
Why is he doing that, do you think?
Because it gives the page a visual rhythm, and it
flow, in a way,
Your
yeah.
eye, at least to an American reader, and it could be different here in India, but an American reader is always trained to look at the captions first. And so these floating pieces of paper create a zigzag pattern that directs your eye through the imagery, through the open panels and the closed panels, and they create a sort of a rhythmic counterpoint. Or a harmony or a counterpoint to the rhythm of the images in the panels. It's very intuitive, and yet it's very sophisticated. And when I've asked him about it, he doesn't really like to talk about it too much because he feels like if I overthink it, I'll ruin it. Because it is a very, insofar as it's rhythmic, it's musical.
Exactly, it is like a score, which is how Chris Ware's described comics as being like a musical score that you perform. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, interesting.
And of course, yeah, Paul, you had a wonderful slide in there.
There's
Maybe
one more,
next.
you pick up the next one. Yeah.
So yeah, this is also something.
This is from Footnotes in Gaza.
Gaza.
I think it's also worth thinking that one of the reasons perhaps why Joe's cartoon journalism in general has had an impact is that we are surrounded by 24-hour news. We can see terrible events as they happen, kind of thing. We're surrounded by moving image, ephemeral image, and for me, that is as I mentioned from the beginning, the Jack Kirby reference, this strange cage that we're in of digital virtual stuff, comics don't move. Comics should not be engaging you at all because they're just drawings on paper and they don't move. They've got no soundtracks. They've got no big, fantastic, famous Hollywood, Bollywood actors, tearing up on stage. So they shouldn't work at all. So when they do, they're also there on the page fixed. So the fixed image is something we just don't have in this culture very much anymore. Comics are almost the last place you find fixed images.
That's right, and they take so long to draw.
Drawn images.
They take so long to draw that the story you're getting about Palestine or Bosnia in this
slow
case,
journalism. This is Gaza, yeah. But
Slow journalism is the term that he actually,
It's
slow
journalism, and it's so, and that I think gives
slow
people
meaning perhaps reflective,
Yes.
not just reactive.
they have time built into them metaphorically as well as literally.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is also something interesting because there are many versions of the same event.
Exactly, because there's
And he
memories.
actually draws them.
We know
Yeah.
different people's memories will remember the same thing differently, and so Joe always doesn't necessarily just come down with one person's point of view as this is the only truth.
So that is also something that comics can do, which photograph may not have the privilege, because you can imagine certain things that goes beyond just the truth untruth thing, and you just show every perspective.
Yeah.
Uh,
There are other forms of documentary, if we go to the next one.
Yeah, so-
And other forms of
fic-
real material, if you
Right.
like, biographical material. Here's a beautiful graphic biography of Rembrandt, commissioned by the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, which again is an extraordinary for that could happen. And not all that much is known about Rembrandt's life, but this artist was able to expand it and imagine it in a beautiful graphic novel, channeling Rembrandt's own drawing. The next image, please.
Yeah, but Paul, you also have this amazing Louvre series, the
Louvre?
the Louvre series, where a lot of comic artists
In fact,
actually imagine.
Well, the Louvre Museum has been going for more than 10 years now, at least.
Yes.
Commissioning every year, finding an artist, French or international, to come into the Louvre Museum and work with the collections, explore the museum, and develop a graphic novel every year based on that.
And you have amazing Mark Antoine Matthew
extraordinary
and
works.
what Inside Museum Vaults, for example. by Mark
And
Antoine.
even the artist Enki Bilal has been exhibited in the Louvre itself.
in the Louvre, right? Yeah.
This is the story of the suffragette movement, for example, in Britain, to coincide with the centenary in 2014 of women's suffrage in the UK, and told in graphic novel form to enable the story to become humanized. Because history was not really my best subject in school, because it all seemed to boil down to battles and acts of parliament and politicians. And of course, the best stories, like Mouse, takes an enormous, difficult subject and makes it personal and individual and relatable.
Yeah.
And this is what graphic novels about history and biography can do. Yeah. And next, please. Okay,
Yeah.
this is too remarkable. Berlin, I believe, is available, I believe,
Yes.
here. Berlin is a massive project by Jason Lutz. Quite extraordinary achievement over so many years. This is also worth remembering. These graphic novels do not pop out like a sausage machine. These artists have to work sometimes for 10, 20 years developing and refining their work. They are not the work of a Mexican historieta artist doing 20 pages a day.
Right,
And
right.
not always enough money to make them.
They generally take twice as long as a prose novel.
Exactly.
But
exactly.
Berlin was serialized for a long, long
Yeah,
time.
yeah. And just very briefly, the one on the right there, so just go back briefly, We're Still at War is from the Czech Republic. I went there in November last year. They have a whole organization there called Postbellum, which is actually getting people to come forward and audio record their testimonies and their regrets, their experiences. They're often very traumatic experiences under the Nazis and under the communists. And what's now happened is that some of these people are now meeting with graphic novelists, working together to make short stories based on comic stories based on their experiences. So these are very important cathartic reconciliations of what people have done in the past in the Czech Republic.
Wonderful.
Okay, and next up, we have just briefly.
I think this is something very, very
This is
exciting. And
as you may be familiar a little bit with, in Thailand there was basically a military coup in every other sense, when an election was overturned, and there's very much nervousness in Thailand. There's huge respect, quite rightly, for the monarchy, for the Thai king, but the Thai king was criticized very privately for not intervening and not preventing this from happening. These two Italian creators, next please, have developed a story called The King of Bangkok, Next, please. This isn't very clear. Which is explaining what happened through the lens of ordinary people, workers, laborers who come from the countryside to Bangkok and get caught up in the protests against the suppression of this left-wing, labor-supporting, worker-supporting government.
It's so abstract. That's
This
one
is
of the
pretty
most.
abstract.
That's
It's
one of the
beautiful,
most
isn't it?
abstract comics.
And next, it
I've
also
seen.
uses very dramatic use of real newspapers. This is made by Italian authors, but this year, next please, it is also coming out in Thai, in Thailand.
So it also is very important, the transmission of the work, right?
Yeah.
So a Thai artist may not actually do this.
A Thai
right?
artist would be too nervous to do this,
Yeah.
but fortunately a Thai publisher is going to bring this out. I think it's
that's
going to have
wonderful.
a big impact. I think that's probably it. And the next one? Oh yeah, we can come back.
Yeah, I think we can come back to the photography and the
Yeah.
drawing thing,
Because
So this is an amazing book which amalgamates both.
What do you think of
So
Gravett
what do you
as
think,
a
Dan? I mean,
photographer? Yeah.
Well, I mean, what's interesting about this is that this photographer had taken many, many photos of Afghanistan, but only 3 or 4 of them were used. And as Paul explained to me just an hour or 2 ago, he ran into an artist who said, let's not let those go to waste. Let's use the contact sheets, which have the form of comics in that they run with panels in between them and
Yeah.
borders.
Yeah.
And let's integrate those into the story with no text or commentary, just to create a sort of dialogue so you can see what the difference between comics and film photography is on the same page.
So it has an interesting effect because Guibert drew, the scenes that the photographer, that the reporter, that the Médecins Sans Frontières reporter in Afghanistan in the 1980s hadn't photographed. So whenever there were gaps, he could fill them. And by leaving the photographs untampered, there's no attempt to turn them into something cheesy like a fumetti, where you
Right.
have people sort of spouting speech balloons or fixing strange expressions. It really uses photography respectfully
Yeah.
and powerfully. And it's an interesting experience because Guibert's drawing is very refined, very almost like Hergé, like Tintin. It's a clear line, simplified drawing. Whereas, of course, the photographs in black and white, but they're very intense. They're very richly full of detail and atmosphere. And you realize the strengths of both are being
Right.
used here.
Right.
Yeah, it's a really remarkable book. Next, please.
yeah, this is interesting.
This
Yeah.
is by the British artist Kate Evans, who went to the jungle, the refugee camp settlement in Calais. Hence, and she was using, by the way, here you can see the lace which she's used, which is traditional from Calais, French lace for her borders between the panels. And she was able to meet the refugees and draw them. And because she wasn't a photographer, because she wasn't an intrusive journalist, she was able to really bond and connect with these people who were nervous about being photographed, nervous
Yes.
about being identified. But they opened up to her, told her all their stories, and she converted them into this beautiful graphic novel called Threads, which is really, again, brings you into this world in a very humane way. And next?
Yeah,
Okay, and
this
just to
is-
finish with this, this is an extraordinary, just like long form, which was mentioned earlier, which includes quite a lot of graphic documentary content. This is a new anthology from Taiwan called Monsoon, which is a bilingual Chinese and English, Asian-based documentary comics anthology. Very exciting new publication.
That's also kind of a future, like the
future,
anthology is coming up.
Anthologies are very much
Yeah,
the future.
very much the future.
collective.
It's tough, actually. It's tough to compile, get everybody in. But once you get it, I mean,
I really admire their use of the word documentary comics.
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, nonfiction comics is weird because we're defining ourselves by what we're not.
Uh-huh.
You know,
Yeah.
like nonfiction sounds like the Antichrist. You're defined by what you aren't. But I think
Yeah.
documentary is much more
Much-
accurate.
Well, that was the problem, wasn't it, with Mouse? Because when Mouse first went into the New York Times bestseller list, it was put into the fiction category,
Right.
Because it was a graphic novel. A novel, of course, is normally a work of fiction. It was a non-fiction graphic novel, and Spiegelman had to ring the New York Times, I believe, and say, "You've actually the Holocaust did happen. This
Yeah.
is based on real events.
Yeah.
Maybe you should move it into the non-fiction category."
It led to
Yeah.
many awkward interactions at bookstores when people
Yes.
realized that a memoir about the Holocaust was being shelved with the fiction.
With fiction.
Yeah, that led to some reconsideration.
Okay, next.
next,
Okay.
of course, we bring Dan in because Dan has also written an amazing book on Chris Ware. And of course, this is Chris Ware's art. And Dan has this very interesting idea about the bodily, the bodily movements as depicted in comics, right? Has worked on it. So can you just, walk us through this? Because
Sure.
this is very
Oh, yeah.
exciting because normally 12 panels with subtle bodily movements, what really happens in this? I mean, Dan, can you get back to this?
Sure. I mean, I guess the first thing I would say is you can't read the words that the man is saying, but it doesn't matter, because when I asked Chris about this page, he told me that what the guy is saying is just nonsense. This page is really about body language. And when you look at these small gestures he's doing, he's trying to expand the comics language so that it can encompass more than just sort of the traditional biff bang pow movements. He's trying to capture the sort of micro expressions and micro gestures that an actor would use in a stage play, or especially in a film where you can do close-ups. And it's just a scene where this man is designed to show that he is full of hot air, which you can tell if you just read his language. I mean, if you just read his body language, you can see that he's a narcissist who's just talking to hear himself, and nobody else is allowed to participate in the conversation. I think it's remarkable when this came out in the mid-90s. It was remarkable among cartoonists because Chris Ware is famous for having some of the most complicated, diagrammatic, schematic layouts of any artist. But this is actually as simple as comics get. This is just a 12-panel grid. I don't know what the cinematic equivalent would be, but
it's like a fixed shot, isn't it, really?
It's a fixed shot.
And certainly it goes counter to most received wisdom in comics that you have to keep the panels changing, be very cinematic and move around a lot.
This is also, a kind of democratic paneling,
It actually
every kind of the panel
looks
is
kind of
same.
dull to me.
Yeah, it does, and it's sort of meant to be.
It's meant to be.
It's
exactly.
meant to be, and I think that's...
And you're
that's-
mentioning micro-expressions. That is also one of the real strengths of comics, because where else do you see the subtle changes and nuances in facial expression and body language fixed on a page for you to observe?
Yes.
In a movie, you'd watch it, but it
it goes out, yes.
It disappears. This is what comics
So
can
it
really...
unspools in your mind more slowly at your own
and
pace.
you can study, you can look back at them,
Yeah.
you can really observe.
And I think this image is especially remarkable in light of the next slide. If you could go to the next slide. So this is what his comics used to look like. I actually gave a 60-minute talk about just this one comic strip once. I'm not going to do that
Have we
today.
got an hour? Could we got an extra hour?
Actually, I think
Wish we could.
I think we've got 20 minutes left. But I just wanted you to know that it's just interesting to see an artist who makes these sort of conceptual and intellectual demands on his readership. Actually, as time goes by, he actually simplified his artwork and simplified the cognitive load that his comics required in order to convey more emotion and less intellect.
Yep. So, yeah,
Next slide.
this is a combination of both.
Yeah, and then what he's figured out toward the end of this is the climax of Jimmy Corrigan.
Yeah.
Which he said when he drew this page, he had in mind the closing moments of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. This is where he sort of fused those two ways of using the comics language, the sort of basic stripped-down fixed shot along with the schematic diagrammatic. And I won't walk you all the way through this page, except to say that it unites present-day Chicago with Chicago in 1893. So it's 100 years of racial and family history compressed into one image that can be read in about 30 seconds.
Yeah, the next one is...
or longer, yeah.
Yeah,
Because
so...
this clearly, this is one of the strengths of comics, is that as we'll be discussing, is that time is there on the page, past, present, and future, all at once.
Yeah.
And when you're flicking through a graphic novel, you're flicking through time, because you've got the story, of course, is developed, and you can see it. I mean, this is the big difference for me. I mean, obviously, a literary novel,
Yes.
a word just in prose, you could say, well, that's doing the same thing, but you're not going to find it quite so easily to move around inside those hundreds of pages and find that reference, that visual cue, because there's a lot of braiding, as it's called, the technical term. Where
Spiegelman has a beautiful quote,
Yeah.
Comics choreograph time,
Yes,
right?
choreographed time, exactly.
Yes.
And because you're observant, you have to be observant in comics,
Yeah.
don't you? You can then spot motifs and references. Artists are very conscious of how they can make you aware of a story and follow and recognize the patterns.
That's right.
It's pattern building,
And
essentially.
and it's much easier to do than it is in prose.
Yes.
Like when you're reading Joyce or Faulkner,
Uh-huh.
and you hear a name or something rings a bell, and you think, oh yeah, 2 chapters back, there was a reference
Are you
to
going to
that.
find that easily?
But you remember, well, my thumb was here, it was somewhere, and it takes forever to find it. In comics, you can
Because
do
it's
it almost
visual,
instantly.
You're able to move around.
There's a
inside.
giant marker there.
So graphic novels, I think, are a very inhabitable story space. You really can navigate it and explore it. Not only is it fixed, but it's also very fluid.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
And of course, can we have the next one? And this is amazing. This is one of the best comics.
Yeah,
So
take
this
this one
is
away.
Another very innovative graphic novel is this one by Mazzucchelli. What's clever here, maybe you can just about make out in the 2 central panels, you can see 2 characters. On the left is a character drawn like a kind of architectural blueprint in geometrical
Yes.
designs. He is a paper architect who has never built a single building. And of course, he teaches. Aha. And on the right is a Japanese sculptress. She's drawn in pink with a kind of feathered sort of outline,
Yes.
volumetric drawing, a bit like a Henry Moore drawing. And when they meet, go to the next image, they fall in love. Next, please. And here you can see how their 2 drawing styles have overlapped. The man taking on the woman taking on the man. Even the furnishings around them have taken on their characteristics. And we realize they are definitely harmonizing. They are getting on with each other. And what Mazzucchelli does in his book here is he uses different drawing styles for different characters. And he also uses different speech balloon shapes and type so that you can personalize and individualize all of the characters, the main characters. I'll go through quite quickly. The next image, please. In this page, you can just about make out on that large central panel, they are arguing, and the 2 characters, the man and women break apart into their individualized drawing styles. The architect goes back to his geometric drawing, the sculptress back to her sort of sculptural drawing, basically. Okay, next. I think I'm going to just go forward a bit more quickly. Next one, please. Next one. Okay, here I want to show you the 2 characters talking to each other. Now here you can see distance. Even though you can't read all the text, you can maybe see how the architect is speaking in big, square, rectangular balloons and in capital letters, while the sculptress, the woman, is speaking in feminine, supposedly curvaceous speech balloons, speaking in upper and lower case. And here the architect is blocking her speech balloons. He keeps interrupting her and stopping her speaking. This is clearly where they're not getting on very well. The next page, I can show you next, thank you, shows you where they're now starting to fall back in love with each other. And you can see how at the top here, the balloons the tails of the balloons start to intertwine. They connect. And in fact, the gap between the 2 balloons in panel 4 has gone. There's no longer a line dividing his square balloon from her round balloon. And by the end, the tails of the balloons have completely entwined and they have fallen back in love again. Now, isn't that just brilliant? I can see the smiling faces, and you realize this language of comics will never stop being invented. We are in a medium where
wonderful.
I'll be a bit naughty here because we're in a literary festival. I know you can do great things with words, but you can do perhaps even more with words and pictures.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Yeah, that's a wonderful.
Yeah.
But maybe we will.
Do we have time for a couple questions?
Yeah, that is what we'll do. But Paul, since we don't have this to do this to the whole talk in this way because it's a huge kind of thing. But the comics, the way the comics is moving, you can do comics about everything. Believe it or not, there is a guy called Sarkoyak, right? Robert Sarkoyak, who has actually done a comics on the 94-page iTune rules and regulations, which we never read, but we just accept it. It's a comics on that thing, agreement. You can actually do a comics on medical prescription. You can do a comics about anything. That's what is problematic here, is that in Bengal especially and in India, comics is normally regarded as a medium for the children, for the children to do, But here we have amazing comics, and Paul had amazing tales to tell about, say, when Dan was telling, comics for the blind, for example, right?
Yeah.
We had some things, we cannot show it, but maybe since we have a kind of an overview of what comics can be, this is, of course, this comics, this, so there is a This is a very popular one because it's taught here.
Do you want to see if there are any questions?
Yeah, we want to have some questions, but also, I must tell before going to that, comics can also be used, as a means of resistance, for example, right? So, a lot of political protests can be, actually can have comics as a medium, it's a very good medium. So what I want, of course, is to throw open, the whole session, because we did a very structured kind of conversation. We want a bit unstructured one. So if somebody of you, come up with questions to either Dan or Paul, and you have many sort of hands, but let us go a bit, from the back maybe, and then I'll come to you. So can you just ask some questions? You can stand up, yeah, and you have the mic. So please go ahead.
Thank you for this quite illuminating lecture. My question is, I've been always a fan of Tintin, and my question is, from childhood, I used to wonder how did Hergé write is the pronunciation Hergé, H-E-R-G?
It's Hergé.
Hergé. So how did Hergé make so intricate drawings like the edges of the cars? They're so detailed. He used to draw by hand, right?
Yes. Oh, yes. Not digital.
So how is this possible? So detailed, the car edges, the rockets, like Destination Moon, the rockets, the edges, the stands, the pillars. How is it possible for a 20th century comic writer to draw in this intricate style?
Yes, I know what you mean. Well, Hergé worked with the clear line. As you know, what's so distinctive about Tintin is the ligne claire, the very crisp outline. But when you're trying to draw like Hergé, maybe you're trying to draw like Hergé, he doesn't start with a clear line. If you ever see any Hergé originals, he was doing lots in pencil. He would draw sometimes so much that the pencil goes through the paper because he's trying to get to the absolute essence of the perfect line he uses. In terms of the accuracy, he also worked with a whole studio. He had Hergé Studios. He worked with great artists like Edgar B. Jacobs, and they would. So he had specialists who would also help him draw costumes or settings or cars. He wasn't necessarily drawing every single element. In that sense, he was a bit like the studio system used in manga, in fact, where you have some specialists who do backgrounds or skies or buildings. But you're right, he was very keen to be super accurate. And that drive for accuracy also came because, as you know, the early Tintin stories were quite propagandistic. The ones certainly set in, for example, Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, Tintin in the Congo, were quite colonialist, quite anti-communist, for example.
Racist.
And racist, basically racist.
Totally racist.
Yes, and he realized when he came to do the Blue Lotus and met Chang, the young Chinese student in Brussels, that he needed to be more accurate. He couldn't just be following what his paymasters at the newspaper he was working for told him. He had to know more about and research the subject. There's a famous page actually in Blue Lotus where Chang discusses with Tintin the crazy ideas that we have about what Chinese people are like, and he dismisses those myths. So accuracy became central to Hergé's work. Yeah.
In fact, it's not only Urgent, even Chris Ware you saw, he also draws by hand. I mean, this is amazing to know that Chris Ware, I'll just take her question first and of course come to Debuda then. Can you just, because she's sort of getting her.
So, the number of questions I have here will make for a full...
Maybe one, because we have, I think, 3, 4.
But I'll just go one.
Sure.
Yeah.
Do you think it's unfair that the various art styles in manga and comics are just grouped together as comic style or cartoons and not given any formal recognition as unique art styles?
Dan?
Could you guys reformulate the question? Do I think it's unfair that comics are...
Yes.
Like describing comics as some kind of overall generic thing. There is a comic style, as opposed to there's obviously a huge diversity of style. How do you?
Well, comics are a medium. They're not a genre, but they've been misunderstood as a genre for so long that they tend to get lumped together. But they are a medium. So it's fine if they're all lumped together because it's a medium, just like there are many different genres of film. And just like there are many different genres of novels and prose. So it doesn't bother me.
Okay. From the last, can we have? Yeah, we have, I think we can take 2, 3 at the most. Maybe a short question, keep your question short because then of course, we'll make it out. Just a minute.
I mean, just a question to Paul. When would we stop seeing pictures of Dali or say Picasso or even their names to legitimize what comics art is? It can stand on its own.
Absolutely, but I'm just giving you cultural context there, Debda. Yeah, but you're quite right. But it's interesting because actually Dali didn't just credit comics, as you may know, Debda. He actually made comics. And there are many hidden parts of the fine art world where Picasso actually said, I wish I'd made comics. And he made at least one, the Life and Death of Franco. It's which is in the format of a comic.
So maybe
and I think, it's a good point. The question of how do comics become legitimate without appearing rather too needy, I suppose. And I think we still have a battle, though. But my perspective is simply that, essentially, in France, comics have probably won in the fine art category because we have major exhibitions of comic artists, but they haven't won the literary field in France. You might not be aware of this, but the literary world in France doesn't really regard comics that highly.
Right.
We wouldn't probably have the equivalent of this kind of literary event hosting comics because comics in France is already so big in its own right. Whereas in Britain and probably in America, the literary world has welcomed comics, wouldn't you say?
Yes.
Novelists are raving about Dave Eggers, for example, great acolytes, proponents of comics.
That's right.
You see the graphic novel as
even
a
Margaret Atwood,
Whereas the fine arts world is a little bit more iffy still.
They just appropriate it. I mean, Art Spiegelman, as always, has the best line, which is that Roy Lichtenstein has as much to do with comics as Andy Warhol does with soup recipes.
Okay, short questions, please keep it short.
Thank you very much. I wanted to say it was a fascinating session. The question is about the future of comics. We saw excellent examples of the documentary format, also the predictions of Kirby for what it might be in the future. But my question is, what is the history or the probability of using cartoons, comics, for activism, for disseminating information,
I think that's
for increasing awareness? Thank you.
Well, that is... Do you want to comment?
No, you had a better riff on this. I think, especially in the Indian context.
A lot of things happening in India, of course, as you all know. If you go to the web, for example, go to Blended, for example, the great comic artist Appu Pen is actually taking on the establishment, the central establishment head on, and he's doing through web comics. A lot of things is happening, and it's a very good medium. Sarkoyak has actually this amazing book called The Unquotable Trump, right, which came out. It's a very, very exciting book where he's taking on one of the most powerful men in a very, very interesting way, subverting things. So this always has got traction, and in a country like India, I think it will go bigger because I think it's a language that has got, this thing of resistance built within it. So that's what I believe.
So I think comics I went to see the exhibition yesterday at the Currency Building about Bengali art. Have you seen that exhibition? Fantastic exhibition. I want to put this quote from
Chitta Prasad.
Chitta Prasad said, in India, an artist cannot long remain without expressing his moral and political views, or her perhaps, without searching for a way to create a tradition which will make art the popular language of this country.
I think this is amazing. This sums it up because Chitta Prasad was doing it much, much earlier, but I think it's now that we should all do this.
I think
everybody.
Alan Moore was writing there was a Occupy Comics anthology where he wrote very eloquently about he sees comics right now coming into their own as a force for activism, definitely.
I'm sorry, I have to end the session, but last question, and that's why I'm ending the session. There are a lot of questions here, and the conversation can go on because comics, we actually did the entire session almost standing up. It's not the set kind of thing in this festival, so we broke a bit of it, but
It's not exactly a question, rather a form of opinion. I wanted to ask your opinion on the perception of comics as it changes with age, because I read Tintin when I was a kid, and now when I read Tintin, I see the racism, the perceptions that Westerners have about Easterners, which I did not notice when I was a kid. Also, the types of comics we read also changes because from Tintin now I have advanced to Moss and Satrapi and Persepolis. So
Yeah, well,
opinion of
comics
that.
can speak to you throughout your life. I mean, you will read comics all your life. Why, you would never think, I've outgrown film, I've outgrown novels, I've outgrown music. As long as you keep your heart and mind open and receptive, and don't hold on to something from childhood as some sort of terrible nostalgia fixation, then move on, and there are comics that can speak to you at every stage of your life, which is one reason why I'm never going to be bored with comics, because I'm always finding new ideas and things that speak to me. Yeah, I'm glad you found that too. You've moved from Tintin to other things.
And now I think they're going to pull us off the stage.
Yeah, so this is
Thank
a
you
great-
all.
Thank you, all of you. I mean, you have been a wonderful audience. And thank you so much.